December 7th, 1944. 3 years to the day after Pearl Harbor. And something just as insane is about to happen in a frozen German forest. 120 American Rangers are staring up at a hill. Not just any hill, Hill 400. The most fortified, most defended, most impossible piece of real estate in the entire Hürtgen forest. The Germans have artillery zeroed in on every approach. Machine gun nests covering every angle. Underground bunkers that bombs can't touch. And they've already slaughtered everyone who tried to take this hill. An entire infantry division tried and failed. Hundreds dead. Hill 400 stood unbroken. Now the brass is sending 120 Rangers to do what thousands couldn't. The math doesn't work. Everyone knows it. The Rangers know it too. But here's the thing about these men. They didn't fight because the odds were good. They fought because the mission mattered. So at 0730 hours, in freezing December cold, these 120 Americans started running straight up that hill. By nightfall, only 25 would still be standing. But the Germans? They'd never get their hill back. This is the story of the Battle of Hill 400 and why the German High Command couldn't believe what happened. Let's break it down. To understand why 120 men were asked to do the impossible, you need to understand where they were fighting. The Hürtgen Forest. 50 square miles of dense, dark, frozen hell. The largest battle on German soil in World War II. And the longest single battle the U.S. Army ever fought. This wasn't France. This wasn't the beaches of Normandy with their open fields and clear sight lines. This was something else entirely. Imagine a forest so thick that sunlight barely reaches the ground. Now imagine it's winter. The trees are covered in snow, but underneath the ground is ground. Now imagine it's winter. The trees are covered in snow, but underneath the ground is a maze of ravines, gorges, and hidden positions. The Germans knew every inch of this forest. They'd been fortifying it for months. Every trail was mined. Every clearing was a kill zone. Every hill was a fortress. American commanders thought they could punch through this forest in a few weeks. They were catastrophically wrong. By the time the Rangers were called in, the Hürtgen Forest had become a meat grinder. American units would enter the forest with full strength and emerge, if they emerged at all, as shattered remnants. The 28th Infantry Division entered the Hürtgen with 14,000 men. After 2 weeks of fighting, they had suffered over 6,000 casualties killed, wounded, missing, or captured, and they hadn't achieved their objectives. The 4th Infantry Division tried next. Same story. Then the 9th. Then the 83rd Division after division fed into this forest, and the forest consumed them all. But here's what made Hill 400 special even by Hürtgen standards. Hill 400. The Germans called it Berg dominated the entire landscape. At 400 meters elevation, it provided unobstructed observation of American positions for miles around. Any German artillery observer sitting on that hill could call down fire on American troops with pinpoint accuracy. Every supply convoy, every troop movement, every gathering of soldiers could be spotted and destroyed. As long as the Germans held Hill 400, the American advance was frozen, literally stopped cold. The Army tried to take the hill in late November. The 121st Infantry Regiment was given the mission. They attacked through a narrow approach, uphill, through minefields, against prepared positions. They were slaughtered. Hundreds of casualties in hours. The survivors pulled back. Hill 400 remained in German hands. The brass was getting desperate. The Allied advance across Western Europe had stalled. Winter was setting in, and every day the Germans held that hill, more Americans died. That's when someone had an idea. Send in the Rangers. Now, here's where the story takes a turn. Because the Rangers weren't just regular infantry. These were some of the most elite, most intensely trained soldiers America had ever produced. The 2nd Ranger Battalion, born in blood on the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc, June 6, 1944. If you know anything about D-Day, you know about Pointe du Hoc, a 100-foot cliff face that the Rangers had to scale under withering German fire to neutralize gun positions that threatened the entire Omaha beach landing. They were supposed to be reinforced within hours. Instead, they held for 2 days, cut off and surrounded, until relief finally arrived. Of the 225 Rangers who made that climb, only 90 were still able to fight when it was over. That was 6 months before Hill 400. And the men who survived Point du Hoc, they were still here, still fighting, still Ranger. Let me introduce you to some of them. Lieutenant Leonard Lommel, if there was a Mount Rushmore of World War II Rangers, his face would be on it. At Point du Hoc, after climbing that cliff under fire, Lommel personally found and destroyed the German guns that threatened the beach. He did it with thermite grenades and a knife, crippling his own hands in the process. 6 months later, those hands had healed, and he was about to charge up another impossible objective. Sergeant Herman Stein, a kid from the Bronx who'd never imagined himself as a soldier, let alone a ranger. But somewhere between basic training in Normandy, he discovered something about himself. He didn't freeze under fire. If anything, he got sharper. First Sergeant Bill Petty, the kind of NCO that every officer prays for. Calm under pressure, respected by every man in the company. The guy you looked to when everything went wrong. Captain John Miller, Company D commander. Harvard-educated, soft-spoken, and absolutely lethal in combat. The kind of officer who led from the front because he couldn't imagine asking his men to go somewhere he wouldn't go himself. Private First Class William Anderson, 19 years old. Lied about his age to enlist. Wrote letters home to his mother every week, telling her not to worry, that he was staying safe. None of those letters mentioned the firefights, the artillery barges, or the friends he'd already buried. These weren't supermen. They were ordinary Americans who had survived enough combat to sand away everything that wasn't essential. What remained was pure soldier. By December 1944, the 2nd Ranger Battalion had already lost more than half its original strength. The men who remained were hardened beyond anything training could produce. They knew each other, trusted each other, would die for each other. And soon, many of them would. December 6, 1944. The Rangers received their orders. Take Hill 400. Tomorrow. The briefing was short. There wasn't much to say that the maps didn't already show. The hill rose 400 meters above sea level, hence the name. The approach was across open ground, uphill with limited cover. The Germans had bunkers, trenches, and fighting positions dug all along the slopes. Artillery was pre-registered on every avenue of approach. The intelligence officer laid out what they knew about enemy strength. At least a company of German infantry, dug in and waiting. Machine guns, mortars, maybe more. Captain John Miller of Company D studied the maps. The terrain was brutal. A frontal assault meant running uphill in the open against prepared positions. The tactical playbook said this was suicide, but there wasn't another option. The hill had to fall, and it had to fall fast. The plan was simple not because simplicity was elegant, but because complexity would fall apart the moment the shooting started. 3 companies would participate, D, E, and F. About 130 Rangers total. Company D would lead the assault on the right side. Company F would hit the left. Company E would follow in reserve, ready to reinforce wherever the attack bogged down. H-hour was set for 0730. First light. They'd have artillery support for 15 minutes before stepping off. After that, they were on their own. The Rangers sat in their positions that night. Some wrote letters. Some prayed. Some just stared at the darkness and thought about what morning would bring. Private Anderson, the 19-year-old, wrote what would be his last letter home. It was shorter than usual, just a few lines telling his mother he loved her. He sealed it and handed it to a friend who was staying behind with the support elements. "Mail this tomorrow," he said, just in case. Lieutenant Lommel gathered his platoon for a final talk. He didn't give a speech, didn't try to inspire them with words. They were past that. He simply told them the objective, the approach, and what they'd do when they reached the top. "We go up that hill," he said. "We take it, we hold it, and we don't give it back." That was it. No promises about survival. No guarantees about anything. Just a mission. First Sergeant Petty moved among the men, checking equipment, offering a word here and there. He'd done this before in Normandy, too. It was his ritual, his way of saying goodbye without saying goodbye. At 0700, the Rangers moved to their jump-off positions. The artillery barrage started on schedule, shells screaming overhead to slam into the German positions on the hill. For 15 minutes, the hillside erupted in fire and smoke. Trees splintered. Earth fountained into the air. The noise was overwhelming. And then, at 0730, the barrage stopped. Silence. The kind of silence that felt heavier than the explosions. For one long heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the Rangers stepped off. 0730 hours. December 7th, 1944. The assault begins. The first seconds were chaos. As soon as the American artillery lifted, the German machine guns opened up. They'd survived the barrage, most of them, anyway, and they knew exactly what was coming. The Rangers were running. Not walking, not advancing, tactically running. Full sprint across open ground, uphill, into the teeth of enemy fire. Standard infantry doctrine said you don't charge into prepared positions. You suppress them, flank them, reduce them systematically. But doctrine also said you need time, and time was the one thing the Rangers didn't have. Every second they spent on that open slope was another second for German bullets to find them. The only chance was speed. Pure, terrifying speed. Men started falling immediately. The German machine gunners were experienced, their fields of fire carefully planned. Each burst of fire cut down one or two Rangers. Then another burst. Then another. But the Rangers didn't stop. They couldn't stop. To stop was to die in the open. The only safety, if you could call it, that was up. On top of the hill. Among the enemy. Lieutenant Lommel was sprinting at the front of his platoon when the man beside him dropped without a sound. No time to check. No time to mourn. Keep running. Another man went down, clutching his leg. Another caught a bullet through the chest and collapsed forward. The snow was turning red behind them. The distance from the jump-off point to the German positions was about 400 meters. Across open ground, uphill under fire. It felt like miles. By the time Company D reached the first German trenches, they'd lost nearly a third of their men. Dead or wounded, scattered across the slope behind them. But they reached the trenches. And that's when the real fighting began. Close quarters, face-to-face, rifle butts and bayonets and grenades. The kind of fighting where you could see the enemy's eyes when you killed him. Sergeant Stein, the kid from the Bronx, found himself in a German fighting position with two enemy soldiers. There wasn't time to aim. He fired from the hip, once, twice, and both Germans dropped. Then he kept moving, climbing higher. Private Dreyer took a bullet through the shoulder, but kept fighting. Another Ranger, Private McCloskey, caught shrapnel in his face, but refused evacuation. They were Rangers. They didn't quit. The German defenders fought back with everything they had. These weren't second-rate garrison troops. They were hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, transferred west to defend the fatherland. They knew how to fight, but the Rangers were something else. You have to understand what was happening in those first moments of the assault. This wasn't a coordinated attack anymore. It was a brawl, a murderous scramble up a bloody hillside where the only rule was kill or be killed. Captain Miller was everywhere at once, directing fire, pulling wounded men to cover, shooting Germans who popped out of bunkers. His radio man was dead. His company was scattered, but he never stopped moving forward. By 0800, just 30 minutes after the assault began, the Rangers had reached the summit. Hill 400 was in American hands. The entire assault had taken less than an hour. The same objective that had cost an infantry regiment hundreds of casualties had fallen to 130 Rangers in 60 minutes. But the Germans weren't finished. Not even close. The Rangers reached the top, but they reached it bleeding. Companies D and F had taken the worst of it. Company E, following in reserve, had collected the wounded and pushed up reinforcements as they could. But the math was brutal. Of the 130 Rangers who had started the assault, roughly 50 were already casualties, dead, wounded, or missing. In 30 minutes, Lieutenant Lommel found himself on the hilltop with perhaps a dozen men from his platoon. They'd started with 40. The rest were scattered across the slope below, some wounded, some dead, some still trying to catch up. Private Anderson, the 19-year-old who'd written that last letter, was among the dead. He made it almost to the top before a German machine gun found him. His body would lie where it fell for 2 more days before anyone could retrieve it. Sergeant Stein was wounded but still fighting. A piece of shrapnel had torn through his arm. He'd wrapped it with a field dressing and kept going. There wasn't anyone else. The Rangers had the hill. Now, they had to hold it. The first priority was consolidating the position. The summit of Hill 400 was relatively flat, maybe 100 meters across, covered with the remains of German bunkers, trenches, and shell craters. The trees had been shattered by months of artillery, leaving a landscape of stumps and splinters. Captain Miller ordered his men into the German positions. The bunkers were still intact. The German engineers had built them well. The Rangers would use them now. They had maybe 10 minutes of relative quiet, just enough time to catch their breath, redistribute ammunition, and wonder what was coming next. The Germans told them. At 0820, the first counterattack hit. The Germans came out of the trees on the eastern slope. A full company of infantry, supported by machine guns and mortars. Here's the thing about counterattacks. They work best when the enemy is still disorganized, still catching their breath from the assault. The Germans knew this. They'd been preparing for this moment. The first mortar rounds landed among the Ranger positions, exploding among the shell craters and trenches. Then the German infantry started advancing, laying down suppressive fire as they moved. The Rangers fired back. Every rifle, every bar, every weapon they had. The volume of fire was incredible for such a small force. First Sergeant Petty was on the right flank when the attack hit. He grabbed 3 men and set up a hasty firing position behind shattered bunker. They couldn't stop the whole German company, but they could slow it down. Petty's men caught the lead German squad in a crossfire. 6 or 7 enemy soldiers dropped in the first burst. The German advance wavered, but the Germans kept coming. They had numbers, they had momentum, and they had orders to retake that hill at any cost. The fighting degenerated into chaos again. Germans and Americans tangled at point-blank range. Grenades flew back and forth. Men screamed, bled, died. Lieutenant Lommel found himself face-to-face with a German officer who was leading a squad through the American lines. No time to think. Lommel raised his Thompson and fired. The German went down. His squad scattered. The counterattack lasted maybe 20 minutes. When it was over, the Germans had been pushed back, but the Rangers had taken more casualties. The ranks were thinning. Company D was down to maybe 30 effectives. Company F was in similar shape. Company E had been committed to fill the gaps, so there was no reserve left. And the Germans weren't done. They were just regrouping. At 0900, the second counterattack came. Same pattern. Mortars first, then infantry. This time more Germans. More firepower. The Rangers held. Barely. By the time the second attack faded, ammunition was becoming a serious concern. The Rangers had brought what they could carry, but close combat chews through bullets fast. Sergeant Stein started collecting weapons from the German dead. German Mausers, Mepepatruzich submachine guns, MG, 42 machine guns. It didn't matter what flag was on the weapon. If it shot bullets, it was useful. By noon, half the Rangers were fighting with captured German weapons. American ammunition was almost gone. 1,300 hours. The third counterattack. This one was bigger than the first 2 combined. German commanders were getting desperate. Hill 400 was tactically essential. Every hour it remained in American hands was another hour the German defensive line was compromised. They threw everything they had at the Rangers. 2 full companies of infantry, heavy mortar support, machine guns providing covering fire from 3 directions. The Rangers were exhausted, wounded, running on empty, but they held. Captain Miller was everywhere, directing fire, redistributing men, plugging holes in the line. He'd been hit twice already, once in the arm, once in the leg, but he refused evacuation. "I'm not leaving these men," he told the medic who tried to pull him out. At one point, a German squad broke through the American line on the left flank. It looked like they might roll up the entire position. Then Sergeant Stein appeared with 5 Rangers and a captured MG-42. Stein set up a machine gun in a shell crater and opened fire. The MG-42, nicknamed Hitler's buzzsaw by American troops for its terrifying rate of fire, ripped into the German breakthrough. The enemy squad was cut to pieces. The line held, but it cost. 2 of Stein's 5 men went down in the exchange, and there was no one to replace them. By 1400, the situation was critical. The Rangers had roughly 40 men still able to fight. Ammunition was almost gone. Many of the survivors were wounded. Medical supplies had been exhausted hours ago. Private Roberto Lopez, a Mexican-American from Texas, had been shot through the hand early in the assault. He'd wrapped it in a field bandage and kept fighting. By afternoon, the wound was infected, his hand swelling painfully. He kept fighting anyway. Corporal James Earl, a farm boy from Kansas who'd lied about his age to enlist, had taken shrapnel in the leg. He couldn't walk, so he crawled from position to position, dragging a bar behind him, adding his fire wherever it was needed. These weren't superhuman feats. These were ordinary men pushed beyond ordinary limits, holding on because the alternative was unthinkable. The 4th counterattack came at 1500. Same story. Germans advancing. Rangers firing. Bodies falling on both sides. But something was different this time. The German attacks were getting weaker. Not in ferocity, the enemy soldiers were fighting as hard as ever, but in numbers. The Rangers weren't the only ones taking casualties. The Germans were bleeding too. Each failed counterattack left more of their dead on the slopes of Hill 400. By 1600, the attacks had stopped. An eerie quiet settled over the hill. The Rangers stayed in their positions, weapons ready, waiting for the next assault. It didn't come. Not immediately. Lieutenant Lommel used the lull to take stock. His platoon, what remained of it, held a section of the line, maybe 50 meters wide. He had 8 men. 8 out of 40. They were all wounded. Every single one. Some seriously, some walking wounded, but not a man among them who hadn't spilled blood that day. Lommel moved among them, checking ammunition, checking morale. Nobody was quitting. Nobody was asking to leave. They were Rangers. They'd hold until they were relieved or until they died. Those were the only 2 options. Darkness came early in December. By 1700, the light was fading. By 1800, the hill was wrapped in cold, dark silence. Night fighting in World War II was a different kind of terror. No night vision, no cinemascopes, just darkness, noise, and the knowledge that the enemy was out there somewhere, close enough to touch. The Germans loved night attacks. They used the darkness to infiltrate American positions, sliding between foxholes, cutting throats, creating chaos. The Rangers knew this. They stayed alert. First Sergeant Petty organized rotating watches. Every man would get some rest, but someone was always awake, always listening, always watching. The cold was brutal. December in the Hurtgen Forest meant temperatures well below freezing. The Rangers didn't have winter gear. There hadn't been time to issue it. They huddled in their captured bunkers, wrapped in whatever they could find, and tried not to freeze. Wounded men suffered the most. Shock and blood loss made the cold unbearable. The medics, what medics were left, did what they could. It wasn't much. At 2,100, the Germans came. Not a full-scale assault this time. Something quieter, more insidious. German infiltrators working through the American lines, looking for gaps, looking for weakness. The first warning was a scream cut short from the left flank. Then gunfire. Then confusion. Sergeant Stein was in a bunker with 3 other men when he heard the commotion. He grabbed his rifle and moved toward the sound. In the darkness, shapes were wrestling, fighting, dying. Stein fired at a moving shadow. Missed. A German loomed out of the dark, bayonet gleaming. Stein caught the blade on his rifle stock and drove the man back. Then someone else shot the German, and the immediate threat was over. But the infiltration had succeeded in one way. It had created confusion. In the darkness, Rangers couldn't tell friend from enemy. Several positions were overrun. Several more were abandoned in the chaos. Captain Miller rallied the survivors. Voice hoarse, Wounds bleeding, he gathered what was left of his command and organized a counterattack. A counterattack with maybe 25 men. They moved through the darkness, bunker by bunker, trench by trench. Sometimes they found Germans. Sometimes they found the bodies of their friends. They kept moving. By midnight, the line was restored. The German infiltrators were dead, captured, or driven off. But the Rangers had lost more men, and there weren't many left to lose. At 0200 on December 8th, First Sergeant Petty did count. Effectives remaining, 23 men. 23 out of 130 who had started the assault. Everyone else was dead, wounded, or missing. The wounded had been collected in the largest bunker, where the remaining medic himself, wounded, did what he could. It wasn't enough. Lieutenant Lommel was still on the line, still fighting. He'd been hit twice more during the night, shrapnel in the back. A bullet grazed across his scalp. He was held together by bandages and willpower. 23 men, holding a position designed for 130, with German forces still in the trees around them, still waiting to attack. The night dragged on. December 8th, 1944. 0600 hours. First light. The Rangers who remained were exhausted beyond description. 30 hours without sleep. Many of them wounded. Ammunition down to the last magazines. They should have been finished. The Germans certainly thought so. German commanders had been reinforcing all night, bringing up fresh troops for a final assault at dawn. They knew the Americans on that hill were hanging by a thread. One more push would break them. At 0630, the German barrage began. Artillery and mortars rained down on Hill 400. The shells seemed endless, far more than anything the Rangers had faced the day before. The German command was done playing. They wanted that hill, and they were going to bury the Americans with firepower. Rangers dove for cover. The bunkers shook with each impact. Dirt and debris rained down. One bunker took a direct hit, collapsing on the men inside. 3 more Rangers gone. Just like that. Sergeant Stein was caught in the open when the barrage started. He threw himself into a shell crater and hugged the frozen ground as explosions bracketed his position. Shrapnel tore through the air inches above his head. 20 minutes of hell. Then the barrage lifted, and the Germans came. This was the largest counterattack yet. 2 full companies of fresh German infantry, supported by everything they had left. They came up the slopes from 3 directions, converging on the battered American positions. Captain Miller saw them coming. He was down to 23 men, maybe 20 by now. No reserves. No reinforcements. No hope of backup. He keyed his radio, the one radio that still worked, and called for artillery support. The response crackled through. Fire mission approved. Rounds on the way. American artillery began falling on the advancing Germans. Shells burst among the enemy ranks, scattering men, disrupting the assault. But the Germans kept coming. They were too committed to stop now. The Rangers opened fire. Every rifle, every captured German weapon, every bullet they had left. 20 men against 200. Lieutenant Lommel was on the line, firing, reloading, firing again. Beside him, Private Lopez, his wounded hand useless, firing one-handed, was methodically picking off targets. The Germans reached the perimeter. Close combat again. Rifles, bayonets, grenades. The kind of fighting where you could smell the enemy's breath when you killed him. Rangers fell. Germans fell. Bodies piled on bodies. The thin American line bent, wavered, but didn't break. Sergeant Stein found himself fighting a German officer in a shell crater. The German was bigger, fresher, and had a knife. Stein had exhausted his rifle and was down to his fists. They grappled, rolled, fought for the knife. Then another Ranger, Private Rodriguez, appeared and shot the German at point-blank range. The German assault began to falter. Too many of their men were down. Too much American artillery was falling among them. The survivors pulled back, leaving their dead behind. The Rangers had held. Again, but they were finished. Ammunition was essentially gone. Most of the survivors were wounded. They couldn't withstand another attack. Captain Miller looked at his men, the remnants of his command, and knew. One more German push, and Hill 400 would fall. Not because the Rangers had quit, because there simply wouldn't be enough of them left to fight. And then, At 0800 hours, something beautiful happened. American infantry appeared on the slopes below. Fresh troops, a full company from 8th Infantry Division, pushing up the same hill the Rangers had assaulted the day before. The Germans saw them too. They had been preparing another counterattack. Now, they had to deal with fresh American forces advancing on their flank. The German commander made a decision. They'd failed to retake Hill 400 against 130 Rangers. Now they were facing reinforcements. It was over. The Germans pulled back, disappearing into the forest they knew so well. The relief force reached the summit at 0830. The officer in command, a young lieutenant from Indiana, looked at the Rangers who came to meet him and couldn't believe what he was seeing. 22 men. That's what was left. 22 Rangers, filthy, bloody, exhausted, standing among the bodies of their friends and enemies. "Where's the rest of your unit?" the lieutenant asked. Captain Miller, swaying on his feet, gestured vaguely at the slopes below. "Down there. Most of them." Hill 400 was secure. The mission was accomplished. The Rangers had done the impossible. But the cost. My God, the cost. Of the 130 Rangers who had started the assault, 23 were killed in action. 67 were wounded. 8 were missing. Only 32 men walked off that hill under their own power, and most of them were wounded too. That's a casualty rate of over 90%. Mixture of frustration and grudging respect. A German major, captured later in the war, described the battle. "We outnumbered them at least 4-1. We had the defensive advantage. We launched 5 major counterattacks. Each time, we expected to overwhelm them. Each time they held. By the end, we weren't just fighting soldiers. We were fighting men who had decided they would rather die than retreat." The Germans weren't stupid. They understood tactical advantage, defensive positions, suppressive fire. What they couldn't quantify was willpower, the absolute refusal to quit. Another German officer put it more simply. Those men on the hill were already dead. They just didn't know it yet. And dead men have nothing to fear. The truth is both simpler and more complex. The Rangers weren't fearless. They were terrified, but they had something stronger than fear. They had each other. Listen to the survivors talk about Hill 400, and certain phrases come up again and again. "I couldn't let the guys down. We were all in it together. I wasn't going to be the one who ran." Unit cohesion. Trust. The knowledge that the man next to you would die before he abandoned you. And the absolute certainty that you would do the same for him. That's not something you can train. Not entirely. You can create the conditions for it. You can build units where that bond is possible. But in the end, it either happens or it doesn't. At Hill 400, it happened. Hill 400 became a legend within the Ranger community. For decades after the war, it was studied, analyzed, and taught as an example of what small unit determination could achieve. Modern Rangers, the descendants of those men who climbed that frozen hill, still learn about Hill 400 in their training. It's not taught as ancient history. It's taught as a standard, a reminder of what Rangers are supposed to be. Every December 7th, the anniversary of the assault, surviving Rangers and their families gather to remember. The number of survivors has dwindled over the years. At the last reunion, only 2 men who fought on Hill 400 were still alive. Soon there will be none. The last men who climbed that hill, who fought those Germans, who buried their friends in frozen German soil, will be gone. And in the Battle of Hill 400 will pass from living memory into history. But the story will remain, because some things are too important to forget. What happened on Hill 400 wasn't magic. It wasn't superhuman. It was 130 ordinary Americans facing impossible odds and refusing to break. They were scared. They were tired. They were bleeding. They watched their friends die. And they kept fighting anyway. Not because they wanted to be heroes. Because the mission mattered. Because the men beside them mattered. That's the lesson of Hill 400. Not that war is glorious, it isn't. Not that sacrifice is romantic, it's brutal and ugly and heartbreaking. But that ordinary people, pushed to their limits and beyond, are capable of extraordinary things. Every Ranger who fought on that hill went in knowing the odds. They went anyway. And when it was over, when the relief finally came, the 23 who could still walk came down that hill, and ask the same question. Where do you need us next? That's who they were. That's what Rangers are. So yeah, now you know the story of Hill 400. How 130 Rangers charged into hell and refused to leave. The Germans thought they could break these Americans. They threw everything they had at that hill: artillery, infantry, counterattack after counterattack. They outnumbered the Rangers 4-1. They had every tactical advantage. They lost anyway, because advantage doesn't mean anything when you're fighting men who've decided the mission matters more than their lives. The next time someone tells you that one person can't make a difference, that the odds are too long, the obstacles too great, the challenge too overwhelming, think about Lieutenant Lommel climbing that hill with bullets tearing past his head. Think about Sergeant Stein fighting a German officer in a frozen shell crater. Think about Captain Miller, bleeding from 3 wounds, still directing his men. Think about 23 survivors standing among their dead friends, being asked, "Where do you need us next?" and meaning it. Hill 400 was just a piece of ground, a frozen hilltop in a forgotten forest. But what happened there, what those men did, that's something else entirely. That's the human spirit at its absolute limit, and somehow, impossibly not breaking. Now let me tell you about the men who didn't make it back, because every name on that casualty list was a person with a story. Private First Class Thomas McCarthy was 21 years old when he died on Hill 400. He was from South Boston, the son of Irish immigrants who had come to America looking for a better life. Tommy, as his friend called him, had been a boxer before the war, not a great one, but good enough to win some local amateur fights. He'd enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor, telling his mother he'd be back before she knew it. He made it through basic training, Ranger School, the cliffs at Point du Hoc. He died 50 yards from the summit of Hill 400, hit by machine gun fire while trying to help a wounded friend reach cover. The friend survived. McCarthy didn't. His body wasn't recovered for 3 days. Corporal Edward Williams was the oldest man in his squad at 28. He'd worked as a carpenter before the war, building houses in suburban Philadelphia. He had a wife and a baby daughter he'd never met. She was born while he was overseas. Williams carried a photograph of his wife and daughter in his helmet. He'd look at it every night before going to sleep, touching the faces like they were talismans that could keep him safe. On Hill 400, Williams was hit by shrapnel during the second counterattack. The wound wasn't immediately fatal, but there were no medics available, no way to evacuate him. He bled out over the course of 2 hours, still conscious for most of it, still talking to the men around him. His last words were about his daughter. "Tell her I tried to come home," he said. "Tell her I tried." Private James Patterson was 19, the same age as Anderson. He was from a small town in rural Georgia, the youngest of 7 children on a cotton farm. Patterson had never been more than 50 miles from home before he enlisted. The Army had been his first train ride, his first time seeing mountains, his first time meeting people from places like New York and California. He'd been terrified during training, certain he'd wash out, certain he wasn't tough enough to be a ranger. But he'd made it. He'd proved himself at Point du Hoc, earning respect from men who'd initially dismissed him as a country kid who didn't know anything. Patterson died during the night infiltration, killed by a German knife in the darkness. He never saw his attacker, never had a chance to fight back. His body was found the next morning, still clutching his rifle. Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien was 26, a career soldier who'd been in the Army since 1940. He was from Chicago, the son of a police officer, and he'd joined the Army because the Great Depression had left him with no other options. O'Brien had been in the Rangers since the battalion was formed, one of the original members who'd survived every battle, every training exercise, every moment of danger. He was considered unkillable by the younger men, a superstition that O'Brien did nothing to discourage. On Hill 400, O'Brien commanded a section of the line during the final counterattack. When the Germans broke through on his left, he gathered 3 men and led a countercharge that pushed the enemy back. He was shot twice during the fighting, but kept going. The 3rd bullet killed him instantly. He died still moving forward. Private First Class Samuel Jackson was one of the few black soldiers in the 2nd Ranger Battalion, a rarity in the segregated Army of 1944. He was from Harlem, a musician who'd played trumpet in jazz clubs before the war. Jackson had volunteered for the Rangers because he wanted to prove that black soldiers could fight as well as anyone. He'd faced racism throughout his training, from other soldiers and sometimes from his own officers. But he'd earned respect through performance, through grit, through an absolute refusal to quit no matter what obstacles were placed in his path. On Hill 400, Jackson manned a captured German machine gun during the 3rd counterattack, cutting down enemy soldiers until the gun jammed. He was killed moments later while trying to clear the weapon. After the war, his contributions were largely forgotten, like those of so many black soldiers who fought in World War II. It wasn't until decades later that historians began to recognize what men like Jackson had done and sacrificed. These are just a few of the names. There were dozens more, each one a person, each one a story that ended too soon. The survivors carried these stories with them for the rest of their lives. Many of them couldn't talk about what happened on Hill 400 for years, sometimes decades. The memories were too raw, too painful. The guilt of having survived when so many friends had died was a weight they carried in silence. Lieutenant Lommel, despite his heroism, struggled with nightmares for years after the war. He would wake up screaming back on that hillside, watching men die. His wife learned not to touch him. When he was sleeping, the reflexes developed in combat didn't disappear just because the war was over. Sergeant Stein turned to alcohol for a while after coming home. He'd spend nights in bars, drinking until he couldn't remember the faces of the men he'd killed or the friends he'd lost. It took him years to find his way back, to rebuild a life that felt worth living. Captain Miller left the Army as soon as he could after the war. He never spoke about Hill 400 in public, never sought recognition for what he'd done. When his children asked about the war, he would change the subject. It wasn't until after his death that his family discovered the medals he'd been awarded. He'd kept them hidden in a box in the attic, never displayed, never mentioned. First Sergeant Petty was different. He stayed in the Army, made a career of it. He believed that the best way to honor the dead was to train the next generation of soldiers, to pass on the lessons that had been paid for in blood. He spent years at Fort Benning, teaching young Rangers what it meant to serve, what it meant to sacrifice. Part of their identity. Every Ranger knows the story. Every Ranger understands that they are part of a tradition that was forged in places like Point du Hoc and Hill 400, in moments when courage was the only thing standing between success and failure. The motto of the Rangers, lead the way, was born in moments like the assault on Hill 400. It's not just a slogan. It's a promise. A commitment to go first, to take the hardest tasks, to do what others cannot or will not do. The men who charged up that hill in December 1944 embodied that commitment. They led the way, and many of them paid the ultimate price for doing so. So what do we learn from Hill 400? What's the takeaway from this story of courage and sacrifice? I think it's this. Ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things. The Rangers who fought on Hill 400 weren't born heroes. They weren't superhumans with special powers. They were regular Americans, farmers, factory workers, students, clerks who found themselves in an extraordinary situation and rose to meet it. They were scared. They were tired. They were bleeding. But they didn't quit. They held on because the mission mattered, because the men beside them mattered, because giving up wasn't an option they could live with. And in doing so, they achieved something impossible. They took a hill that couldn't be taken. They held it against overwhelming odds. They proved that courage, determination, and brotherhood can overcome any obstacle. That's the lesson of Hill 400. Not that war is glorious, it isn't. Not that death is noble, it's tragic and wasteful and heartbreaking. But that when the moment comes, when you're tested beyond anything you thought you could endure, you might discover that you're stronger than you ever knew. The Rangers of Hill 400 discovered that about themselves. And in telling their story, maybe we can discover something about ourselves too. Maybe we can find our own Hill 400. The challenge that seems impossible, the obstacle that seems insurmountable, and remember what those men did. Maybe we can draw strength from their example and find the courage to keep going when everything says we should stop. That's the power of these stories. They remind us of what's possible. They show us the heights that human beings can reach when they refuse to break. And they inspire us to be better than we are, to push beyond our limits, to discover the hero that might be hiding inside each of us. So yeah, now you know the story of Hill 400. How 130 Rangers charged into hell and refused to leave. Remember their names. Remember their sacrifice. And the next time you face something that seems impossible, remember what they did on that frozen hillside in December 1944. If they could hold Hill 400, maybe you can hold whatever hill life has put in front of you. Maybe we all can.